Imagine you're peering through the darkness and mist on a cool, foggy autumn morning in East Texas. A large, dark shape moves out of the woods and stops in the middle of a fire break about 75 yards away. You gasp when you realize that shape is actually a gigantic boar feral hog. Quickly gaining your composure, you ready your rifle, place the crosshairs on his shoulder, and squeeze the trigger. You hear that bullet slap home with a distinctive thwack an instant after you squeeze the trigger. The boar lets out a brief squeal, but disappears as quickly as he first appeared, and you realize he is no longer in the fire break after you come back down out of recoil and peer through your scope. The situation, unfortunately, steadily deteriorates over the next few minutes and hours as you search high and low in the surrounding woods and cannot find that hog. Not only that, but you can't find a single drop of blood, despite knowing you hit from the sound of the bullet impacting the animal and hearing him squeal. You renew the search for the hog the next day and look in a completely different area from where you initially thought he ran to. And sure enough, guided by a horrific smell, you eventually find the hog about 200 yards away in some nasty brush. You realize that not only did you make a good shot, but this hog was even bigger than you thought and tips the scales in excess of 200, maybe 250 pounds. And you must use the front end loader on your tractor to dispose of it, thus ending a literally and figuratively gut-churning experience. Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 392 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. That is a true but heartbreaking story involving one of my neighbors and one of the cartridges involved in this episode. Later, I will reveal which cartridge he used on that hog, what I think happened, and what he could have done differently to potentially get a better result. Now, the legendary 270 Winchester celebrates its 100th birthday in the year 2025. So, in honor of that impressive milestone, I conduct a deep dive comparing the venerable 270 to a much newer round with a more modern design that, as you will learn here shortly, has shockingly similar performance. The 6.5 precision rifle cartridge from Hornady. We'll discuss the overall design characteristics and performance specs of each round, and then compare how they stack up next to each other. In addition to typical loads for the 270, I also include data about how the cartridge performs using newer, higher BC bullets in a fast twist barrel. And I will also cover how several loads for each cartridge perform in some ballistic gel test results. Now, before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. And if you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the episode description or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. And if you like the work I do here at the Big Game Hunting Podcast and you would like to support my efforts going forward, you can do so by joining the growing Patreon community I am building at patreon.com/biggamehunter, or just click the link in the episode description. You'll also receive some cool bonuses when you support me there, and in fact, I selected these two cartridges I am using in this cartridge comparison based upon feedback I received from those in my Patreon community. So check it out. Your support is greatly appreciated. But now, let's get started talking about the 270 Winchester versus the 6.5 PRC. We'll start off by talking about the history and design characteristics of these two rounds briefly. Now, the 270 Winchester naturally came along long before the 6.5 PRC, so we talk about it first. To do that, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century with the introduction of another legendary centerfire rifle cartridge, the 30-06 Springfield. That's an awesome cartridge, and as is the case with any well-designed round, wildcatters almost immediately started modifying the 30-06 to accomplish a variety of different tasks. In particular, the folks at Winchester necked the cartridge down to use .277 caliber instead of .308 caliber bullets. The result was the 270 Winchester cartridge, which they released in 1925 with the Winchester Model 54 rifle. The original 30-06 was something of a speed demon when it came on the scene, and it could shoot a 150-grain bullet at a whopping 2,700 feet per second. That might not sound like much today, but that was darned impressive performance when you compare it to other cartridges in use at the time in the USA, like the 4570, the 3030, or even the 3040 Krag, all of which were much slower. Well, the 270 blew the 30-06 away in the speed department, and initial loads for the cartridge shot a 130-grain bullet at an incredible 3,140 feet per second. That is over 400 feet per second faster than the already really fast 30-06. Now, the 250 3000 Savage was the first widely commercially manufactured cartridge to break the 3,000 foot per second barrier in muzzle velocity when it came on the scene in 1915, but it did so with a little 87-grain bullet. The 270 handily beat the 250 Savage in the velocity department and did so with a bullet nearly 50% heavier. That is darned impressive performance even by today's standards. Now, the 270 was and remains something of an oddity with the .277 caliber bullets it used and continues to use. Exactly why designers at Winchester chose that bore diameter still remains something of a mystery. Now, Winchester did work on an obscure Chinese Mauser cartridge way back in the early 20th century that used .277 caliber bullets. That is often brought up as an explanation for where the .277 caliber came from for the 270. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but regardless of why the people at Winchester chose that bore diameter, they did. Now, Remington today is strongly associated with the 7mm or .284 caliber bore diameter. It's not the only company to make 7mm, but it has a bunch of 7mm rounds to its name, right? The 7mm 08, the 280 Remington, the 7 Rim Mag, the 7 Rum, the 7 SAUM, etc. Well, just like how 7mm is something of Remington's bore diameter, the 270 is now Winchester's bore diameter. There aren't as many 270s, but Winchester still dominates this space. Not only with the original 270 Winchester, but also the newer 270 Winchester Short Mag and 6.8 Western. But it all got started with the 270 Winchester. This cartridge uses .277 caliber bullets that are .007 inches, or 7/1000ths of an inch, smaller than the more traditional 7mm bore diameter, which is .284 caliber. It's not a big difference, but it is a difference, and bullets are not interchangeable between those two bore diameters. Now, the 270 was not an instant success, and indeed, it was actually something of a controversial and polarizing cartridge in its early days, not unlike the 6.5 Creedmoor today. In any case, it gradually became more and more popular over the years, and today it's hard to imagine the world without it. Now, Winchester introduced the round with their Model 54 rifle in 1925. The 270 was also one of the original chamberings in the Model 70 when Winchester rolled it out in 1936. And here's a bit of trivia for you. The 270 Winchester is one of 3 cartridges initially offered in the Model 70 that are still offered in the rifle today. Email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you know the other 2 cartridges. The 270 Winchester eventually became an incredibly popular chambering in the Winchester Model 70 and in other rifles. In fact, fully 21% of all pre-64 Model 70s were in 270 Winchester. That makes it the second most popular chambering in that rifle. And considering how many cartridges Winchester eventually offered that rifle in, that is really saying something. Now, we can't talk about the 270 or the Winchester Model 70 without talking about Jack O'Connor. He hunted with many rifles and many cartridges, but his favorite rifle was a Model 70 featherweight in 270 Winchester. This is an awesome, very solid performing cartridge that probably would have stood on its own 2 feet, but O'Connor's articles in Outdoor Life featuring the round undoubtedly helped with its popularity as well. Now, modern factory loads for the 270 shoot a 130-grain bullet at about 3,060 feet per second and a 150-grain bullet at about 2,850 feet per second. And of course, hand loaders can use those bullet weights and some other ones and even gain quite a bit of speed over those factory-published ballistics if they are so inclined. Now, with lighter bullets and even with the more sedate factory ballistics that are used today for .270 Winchester ammo, the .270 is still a really flat shooting round. It is absolutely deadly on deer and antelope at ranges farther than most hunters have any business shooting. With heavier and tougher bullets like 150 grain North Fork or 150 grain Partition, it is also darn capable on game like elk, moose, bear, and the like. Ammo is also plentiful, so are rifles. Recoil is manageable as well. 30-06 recoil is not bad. The .270 has even less recoil than that. Now, the cartridge is not perfect, and we'll cover some of its shortcomings later, but all in all, the .270 is an excellent round, and there is a reason why it remains so darn popular among hunters 100 years after its introduction. The 6.5 precision rifle cartridge came along many years later when a man named George Garner, owner of GA Precision, decided to create what he thought would be an ideal cartridge for use by Precision Rifle Series competition shooters, PRS shooters. Now, in PRS matches, shooters cannot use bullets larger than .308 caliber or with the velocity higher than 3,200 feet per second. Well, George wanted a flat shooting round that performed well in the wind, didn't have too much recoil, fit within those limitations, that would also function in a short-action rifle and did not have a rebated rim or a belt. That's quite a checklist. Now, George initially wanted to use the Ruger Compact Magnum case, which is itself based on a .375 Ruger case, as a parent case for his new brainchild. But he had issues obtaining RCM cases during the ongoing panic buying-induced ammo shortage at the time. This was 2012-2013. Now, Garner initially settled on the Remington Short Action Ultra Magnum, or SAUM, parent case and created what was essentially a 6.5 SAUM. It worked well for his purposes, but he did not like the fact that he had to use a rebated rim case. Things did eventually calm down with the ammo panic buying, and Hornady was able to turn their attention to what would become the 6.5 PRC and redesign that cartridge using a 300 RCM case like Garner originally wanted a couple years later. And Hornady formally rolled out their new 6.5 precision rifle cartridge in 2018, and it received SAMI standardization. Typical 6.5 PRC ballistics with factory ammo are a 143 grain bullet at 2960 feet per second or a 147 grain bullet at 2910 feet per second. Those are the same bullets the 6.5 Creedmoor uses, but the 6.5 PRC shoots them over 200 feet per second faster. Both of these loads are designed to minimize bullet drop and wind deflection at extended range. Plus, designers at Hornady also incorporated many of the so-called modern cartridge design principles Outdoor Life shooting editor John Snow and I discussed in a recent interview to help improve the overall accuracy potential of the new cartridge. He and I talked about that in episode 366 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Check it out to learn more. And yes, with careful hand loading, it is possible to come very close to that 3,200 foot per second muzzle velocity goal Garner had when he first designed his cartridge. Now let's talk about the sizes of the .270 and 6.5 PRC. They're actually very different in their design and overall size. So first, the .270 is quite a bit longer than the 6.5 PRC. Max overall length of the 6.5 PRC is 2.955 inches. The .270 is 3.34 inches long. The 6.5 PRC is a short-action cartridge, while the .270 requires a longer 30-06 length action. However, the 6.5 PRC uses a fatter case that requires a magnum bolt face. The .270 uses a standard bolt face. So the end result is both cartridges have similar case capacities, though. Now, the 6.5 PRC was built with a lot of head height, which means this cartridge has more room outside the case to accommodate really long, sleek, high BC bullets without intruding into the powder column while still staying within SAMI specs. That's not the case with the .270, though. Now, the 6.5 PRC has a 30-degree shoulder. The .270 has a shallower 17.5-degree shoulder. Both have the same SAMI max average pressure of 65,000 psi. Now, the 6.5 PRC uses a .264 caliber bullet, while the .270 uses larger .277 caliber bullets. The 6.5 PRC has a 1 in 8 twist rate. SAMI spec for the .270 is 1 in 10. Now, all of this reflects the different eras each cartridge came from and what they were designed for. The 6.5 PRC is designed to use long, heavy for caliber, high BC bullets and fit in a short-action rifle. The 270 is not. Now, that slower twist rate the 270 uses works really well with bullets in common use 100 years ago, but that overall cartridge design does not play well with really long high BC bullets. We'll talk more about this along with how things have changed for the cartridge in this area since then later in this episode. The 6.5 PRC most often uses bullets in the 120 to 147 grain range. In particular, it uses high BC 120 to 130 grain monometal bullets and 140, 143 grain, and 147 grain lead core bullets. The heaviest bullet I am aware of that is in common use for the 6.5 PRC is the 156 grain Berger Elite Hunter .679 G1BC. Copper Creek offers it in a custom hand load going 2,860 feet per second. Now, the 270 Winchester most often uses bullets in the 130 to 150 grain range. You will see lighter bullets on occasion, and the cartridge can also use heavier, but not very sleek bullets like a 160 grain Nosler partition. Now, copper bullets tend to be pretty light for the 270. They often top out around 130 grains. You'll commonly see the lead core stuff in the 130 to 150 grain range. Highest BC bullets tend to weigh around 140 to 150 grain. They'll have G1BCs up in the high 0.5 range. That's not bad, but as you will see here shortly, it lags the 6.5 PRC in that area. And there are a lot of bullets in the low to high 0.6 range for that cartridge. Nosler makes a .277 caliber, 165 grain Accubon long-range bullet with a .620 G1BC. Berger also makes a .277 caliber, 170 grain Elite Hunter with a .662 BC. Those are the heaviest hunting bullets I'm aware of that you could potentially use in the cartridge. You do need a 1 in 9 twist at a minimum to stabilize them, though. It does depend on your environmental conditions and how fast you are pushing those bullets, but in general, a 1 in 8 twist is probably better. Copper Creek does make a custom hand load for the 270 with that Berger bullet at an advertised muzzle velocity of 2,680 feet per second. And that 165 grain ABLR can be safely hand loaded to 2,800, 2,850 feet per second. Your mileage may vary on the details with that. The 165 ABLR and the 170 Berger will work in a 270 with a fast enough twist rate, but I think the cartridge just lacks the case capacity to push them as fast as I would like to see in order to really take advantage of their performance. And I personally think those heavier 270 bullets are best suited for higher velocity 270s like the 270 Short Mag, the 6.8 Western, the 270 Weatherby, or the 27 Nosler. Those bullets are something of an edge case, though. The heaviest, highest BC bullet commonly loaded in off-the-shelf 270 Winchester factory ammo is 150 grain Nosler Accubon .591 G1BC, 2850 muzzle velocity in the Nosler factory load. And careful hand loading can get that going even faster. The 270 and the 6.5 PRC have very similar case capacities, and they fire bullets of a similar weight at a similar velocity. However, the smaller bore 6.5 PRC uses bullets with higher ballistic coefficients than the 270. So let's see how this shakes out in the real world. To do this, I'll compare 2 different 6.5 PRC loads to 4 different 270 loads. I'll compare Barnes Vortex long range and Hornady Precision Hunter loads for both rounds. I'll also throw in a classic 270 load shooting a 130 grain soft point bullet from Winchester in their PowerPoint line. I'll also use a hand load for the 270 shooting 165 grain Accubon long range. Now, like I said, that's a hand load. Your mileage may vary with velocity. I used 2,850 feet per second for this comparison. You will also need a fast twist barrel because a standard 270 with a 1 in 10 twist probably won't stabilize that bullet enough for good accuracy. The 6.5 PRC loads use 127 grain Barnes LRX .468 BC and 143 grain ELDX .625 BC bullets. The 270 loads use 129 grain LRX .463 BC, 130 grain PowerPoint bullets, 0.372 BC, 145 grain ELDX, 0.536 BC, and 165 grain ABLR bullets, 0.620 BC. So first, I want to point out how darn similar these loads are out to 300 yards. They are almost indistinguishable, 1 inch or less difference in trajectory at that range. Now, the 6.5 PRC does shoot a higher BC bullet at a velocity about as fast as the 270. Now, the 270 Barnes load is an exception, though. It's going over 100 feet per second faster than anything else, so that does translate into better performance downrange, especially with trajectory. The differences are magnified somewhat out at 500 yards, but we're still not looking at a night and day difference between these two cartridges either. The 270 Barnes load has 35 inches of bullet drop at that range. That's fantastic. The 6.5 PRC ELDX load is next with 36.2 inches of drop. The 270 ELDX is next with 37.7 inches of drop. The 6.5 Barnes load has 38.4 inches of drop. Then the 165 ABLR has 39.4 inches of drop. And the 130 load for the 270 brings up the rear with 41 inches of bullet drop. Now, it's worth noting that it takes 300 to 400 yards for the slower but higher BC ABLR 270 load to quote-unquote catch the 130 grain PowerPoint load in terms of trajectory. The 130 PowerPoint has a much lower BC, but also starts out going over 200 feet per second faster. That said, the ABLR has the most retained energy at 500 yards. It edges the 6.5 PRC ELDX load here, has in excess of 55% more retained energy than the 130 grain PowerPoint, though. Now, the 270 beats the 6.5 PRC in the energy department with the Barnes load, about 11% more, but the 6.5 PRC comes out on top with the two Hornady loads, about 8% more. Those are all examples of how higher BC bullets certainly help, but aren't as important at closer range. Smaller changes in muzzle velocity can offset weakness in ballistic coefficient at closer range with retained energy and trajectory. Now, I personally like to have a minimum impact velocity of 2,000 feet per second for optimum bullet performance while hunting. That's not a hard and fast rule, but in general, faster impact velocities result in faster and more dramatic bullet mushrooming of a given bullet type. The opposite is also true, and if the bullet is going too slow when it hits the animal, it won't mushroom much or at all, and you run the risk of having it just penciling through the animal without causing much damage. I am being conservative with a 2,000 foot per second minimum impact velocity. Certainly don't go below that with a copper bullet or a traditional cup and core like the PowerPoint. You can get away with lower impact velocities with the ABLR and ELDX. But if we just go with 2,000 feet per second across the board, the 130 grain 270 load hits that threshold at just 450 yards. The others hit that threshold farther down range, and the 6.5 PRC does best here, crossing that line at 675 yards. The 165 ABLR does it at 625 yards. The rest are all between 500 and 600 yards. Even if you draw that line at a lower impact velocity, the 6.5 PRC will still hit that threshold farther downrange than the 270 when they're both using higher BC bullets that are better suited for extended range performance, ELDX, ABLR, etc. So all in all, the picture is a little muddied here, but overall, the two cartridges are darn similar in performance when both are using premium bullets optimized for the cartridge. Now, as often is the case in these comparisons, those higher BC bullets really shine in the wind. This is where that 130 grain PowerPoint turns into an absolute dog. Indeed, several of the higher BC loads have better wind deflection at 500 yards than the PowerPoint does at 400. I only included that PowerPoint loading to give you an example of how those legacy bullet designs perform at extended range. It's fine at ranges, say 300 yards and in, but you're really throttling the performance of the 270 trying to use something like that at longer range, in windy conditions anyway. But this is also a good example of what the 270 is capable of, even with that slower 1 in 10 twist rate, using bullets kind of at the upper end of the performance that you can use with that twist rate. All right, for example, the 6.5 143 grain load does best in the wind, 13.2 inches of deflection at 500 yards. 165 grain ABLR, 14.1 inches of deflection at 500 yards. And for reference, 130 grain PowerPoint for the 270 at 400 yards is 14.2 inches, a whopping 23.2 inches at 500 yards. But even something like the 145 grain 270 load, you can get that in a off-the-shelf factory load, use it in a rifle with a 1 in 10 twist rate, 15.6 inches of wind deflection. So not as good as the other two, but still really solid. The 6.5 PRC 143 grain ELDX load requires 2.52 MOA of wind hold at 500 yards for a 10 mile an hour full value crosswind. The 145 270 load requires 2.99 MOA of wind hold. So the 6.5 PRC requires basically about a half MOA less wind hold at 500 yards than the 270. When comparing the two Barnes loads for each cartridge, that comes out to 3.27 versus 3.44 MOA of wind hold. So that's even less of a difference. That is 2 clicks of wind hold at 500 for the ELDX loads and less than 1 click of difference at 500 yards in wind hold for the two Barnes loads. So there is a giant difference between that old PowerPoint load and the newer loads for both rounds. But at 500 yards, once again, they are all right there together. Yes, the 6.5 PRC is a little better, but let's not kid ourselves and say it's just amazing and the 270 is terrible when they are both using the same type of bullets. Speaking of comparing different bullets to each other, let's talk about how these rounds perform in ballistic gel. I'll compare a couple of different loads for each one. First, we'll compare each one using the Hornady ELDX bullets, then we'll compare each with Barnes bullets, then we'll talk about some other ones. We'll start with the Hornady Precision Hunter loads for both. So the 143 grain ELDX from the 6.5 PRC makes a very wide wound cavity, delivers decent penetration. A little over 23.5 inches of penetration. The 270 made a similar sized wound cavity, but did not penetrate as far, only 19 inches in this case. And this is actually a theme we're going to see a couple of times in this comparison. Now, I also shot Barnes ammunition for both cartridges into gel as well. Now, note that the Barnes bullets were not exactly the same for these two cartridges. I used 127 grain LRX for the 6.5 PRC and a 130 grain TTSX for the 270. Even so, Barnes bullets both produced narrower wounds compared to the ELDX, but both the 127 and 130 grain bullets delivered fantastic penetration. Over 33 inches for the 127 grain LRX and 28.5 inches for the 130 grain TTSX. Once again, we see the 6.5 PRC out-penetrating the 270. Now, the LRX bullet is I won't say softer, but it does open up faster than the TTSX. It is also a little bit more prone to shed petals with really close-range, high-velocity impacts. So you'll still have the core of the bullet and some petals remaining, but there's less drag on it with fewer petals, and therefore it can veer off to the side or one way or another and also penetrate deeper if that happens. That also tends to happen if the bullets peel or the petals peel farther back. Either way, you're looking at a smaller final frontal expanded diameter, and so counterintuitively, with a softer bullet like this can result in deeper penetration. I think that's why the LRX penetrated deeper than the TTSX here, but both penetrated great. Now, the Barnes bullets did not make as wide of a wound cavity as the ELDX, but they also did not make a small wound either. And in each case, they made very long wound cavities. Now, I've shot a couple of other loads for each cartridge, but no other tests with exactly the same bullets for each one. So first, I've shot 142 grain Accubon long range for the 6.5 PRC. Interestingly, this bullet delivered very similar performance to the ELDX, nearly identical penetration, similar sized wound. That has been my experience with the ELDX versus the ABLR in the same caliber and similar weights across the board. Yes, the ABLR is indeed bonded, the ELDX is not, but I've not observed significantly different performance from the ELDX in gel, though. I also shot 140 grain Berger Elite Hunter from the 6.5 PRC. That bullet performed like advertised, longer but not excessively long neck, but it did make a massive wound with lots of fragmentation in gel. but also much shorter penetration. This was the shortest penetration of any 6.5 PRC load I tested. At 18 inches, that's quite a bit less than the ELDX or the ABLR penetrated. Now, for the 270, I also shot a 130 grain Remington core lock. That penetrated better than all of the other stuff I just mentioned to this point, except the Barnes load. The core lock went about 25 inches in the gel. Still pretty good size wound too, smaller than the ABLR, the ELDX, and the Berger, but just by a little. Now, remember the story from the beginning of the episode with the hog my friend shot and didn't recover until a couple days later. He shot that with a 130 grain Norma whitetail load for the 270. Now, I shot it into dark gel. I did not get good photos of it, but I'll tell you, it made a gigantic wound, but also had terrible penetration. Barely 17 inches of penetration. Barely made it into that second gel block. It penetrated less than the ELDX, the ABLR, even the Berger bullet. Now, that's not surprising. That is a very lightly constructed, lightweight cup and core bullet going fast out of a 270. It was going faster than any of the 6.5 PRC loads I've shot into gel. It was also even a little faster than the lighter Barnes 6.5 PRC load. This performance in gel lines up with what my friend observed on this giant hog he shot. The bullet did not exit, and in any animal that you shoot, the exit wound is almost certainly going to be the one that bleeds more between it and the entrance wound. Now, he did end up confirming, since he found the hog, that his shot was a good one. It was a little bit far back, but not a bad shot, and it hit both lungs. Even so, he found that hog about 200 yards away from where he shot it. That's a straight line, right, as the crow flies, so the hog very well could have run a longer distance than that. And so that's longer than you like to see an animal run, but it's also not like the animal ran like a mile or anything like that either. So this is a case where a better performing bullet could have made his life easier, helped him find that hog faster. Hogs are their own ball of wax, and especially a big hog like this is tougher on a bullet than even a big bear. They have exceptionally thick hides. A big boar will have a thick cartilage shield on its shoulder, a lot of muscle, heavy bone, all of that stuff. None of those things are bulletproof, but this Norma whitetail ammo is some of the worst penetrating stuff I have ever shot into gel. And like I've said in the past, and I'll say again, stuff tends to penetrate deeper in clear gel like I use than is the case on real animals. So if it's not penetrating well in clear gel, it will really struggle in a real animal, especially a tough target like a big boar. So like I said, my friend placed that shot well, just a little bit behind the hog's shoulder. But it hit that thick hide and the cartilage shield and might have hit a rib straight on. It's possible that bullet broke into pieces. It certainly hit the lungs, but it's also very possible that it caused much less damage than would have been the case if that bullet had punched through and had been expanded to more or less twice its original diameter and just plowed right through the vitals of the animal. I'm not trying to trash this Norma ammo. It's advertised and designed for use on whitetail deer. Probably great for that, but shooting a 120 grain deer behind the shoulder is very different from shooting a 250-pound hog at close range with a high-velocity cartridge like the 270 with a light 130 grain bullet. Now, this hunt took place in late 2021. He used that ammo because that's all he could find due to the COVID shortages. What should he have used instead? Now, in a perfect world where he could get the ammo for a situation like that, right, a big, tough animal that you're hunting in thick cover needs a bullet that will penetrate like nobody's business and make a giant wound cavity in the process. The idea here is to cause so much damage to the vitals of the animal, it won't go very far after the shot, and still exit so the animal will leave an easier to follow blood trail. We're not hunting mule deer or pronghorn in open country, where even if it runs 100 yards and then tips over, it might still be in sight when that happens. No, we're hunting thick timber, where if that animal goes more than a few yards into the really thick brush, it gets really hard to find it. So that's why, in this case, I really like that exit wound. But all of that is a tall order. The good news is that the places where my friend and I both do this hunting are thickly vegetated. Shot distances aren't very long either, 50 to 100 yards. Very typical, so that further informs our choices. So with all that in mind, I especially like a couple of bullets. Now, the Barnes bullets I just mentioned will work fine. They do make a smaller wound. Not bad, much more likely to exit, though. Remington core-locked would have been better. Still not ideal. More likely to exit than all of those other bullets except the Barnes. Not a bad choice, especially for the money. There are a couple other bullets I like more than those. One of these is the Nosler partition. Now, there's no 6.5 PRC factory loads with a partition, at least that I can't think of any right now, but Nosler does make 125 grain, 140 grain component bullets in 264 cal you can hand load. They make 130 grain, 150 grain partitions in the 270 component bullets and factory loads. A different friend of mine has used those 150 grain partitions with excellent results on caribou and moose in Canada, as well as plains game in Africa, right? Zebra, blue wildebeest, kudu, and the like. He has recovered just one bullet, and it was from the kudu, which is the biggest of all of those animals. Nothing went more than 50 yards afterwards. In gel, those bullets make a gigantic wound, nearly on par with an ELDX. They also really penetrate, too. I observed over 32 inches of penetration from a 150 grain partition from the 270 in gel. I have not shot a partition out of a 6.5 PRC. I have shot that same bullet in a 6.5 Creedmoor, though, also over 32 inches of penetration. Probably performed very similarly out of a 6.5 PRC. Tyler Friel killed a grizzly bear with a 6.5 Creedmoor a couple years ago with a 140 grain partition. I think that was a perfect bullet for the job. Now, 130 grain or 150 grain partition would be wonderful in a situation like my friend dealt with on that hog. And if you don't get a bang flop, so to speak, you are almost assured to get an exit wound. Much more likely to find that hog with a freely bleeding wound, even after 100 plus yards of tracking. It wouldn't necessarily have been easy, but it would have been less difficult. Now, besides the partition, another bullet is a North Fork semi-spitzer. Now, I have tested 140 grain North Fork semi-spitzer from the 6.5 PRC in gel. That bullet made a massive wound, deep penetration, actually over 36 inches of penetration. That is in line with what I have seen from premium 375 H&H hunting loads. In fact, I shot a gigantic hog with this exact ammo. Pendleton Ammo actually custom hand-loaded it for me, did that spring of 2025. A hog similar size to the one my friend shot, similar range as well, about 75 yards. That is the biggest hog I have ever put on a scale. He tipped it at over 260 pounds on the hoof. I hammered him through the shoulder. He ran about 30 yards after the shot. I did not need to follow blood because he died almost within sight, but he left enough of a trail I could have followed him. Now, North Fork also makes 120 grain semi-spitzer in 6.5 millimeter. They make 130 grain and 150 grain semi-spitzers for the 270 that will probably deliver similar performance. Any of those bullets would be wonderful for a situation like this on the hog or a similar situation on a different animal. Now, you may have noticed how there is a much greater difference in bullet performance for different bullets used in the same cartridge here than is the case for the same bullets used by going from one cartridge to the other, right? There's more of a difference going from a semi-spitzer to an ELDX or an ELDX to a Barnes in the 270 than there is going from an ELDX in the 270 to an ELDX in the 6.5 PRC. Now, it is worth noting that, at least with this stuff I tested here, the 6.5 PRC consistently seemed to penetrate better than the stuff I shot from the 270. Stuff like the ELDX tended to have less penetration for both. Stuff like the Barnes tended to have much better penetration for both. But the wound cavities for each one were very similar, and the general amount of penetration, that is to say, a lot of penetration or less penetration, was consistent going from one to the other when using the same bullets. That is one of the big takeaways I want to emphasize for this episode. We'll talk more about this at the very end. I do have to give my normal disclaimer anytime I talk about gel, though. Results in clear gel like this don't normally translate one-to-one into real-world situations on game. Bullets tend to penetrate better, but not make as large of a wound in gel versus a real-life animal. Animals also aren't completely homogeneous in gel like this either, so just take this all as a general trend. I'm not saying that if a bullet penetrates X number of inches in gel, it will penetrate exactly that far in real animals from every angle, regardless of what it hits all the time. I'm saying that if a bullet demonstrates wide, shallow penetration in gel, it will probably produce wide, shallow penetration in animals. Same is also true if bullet A penetrates better than bullet B in gel, etc. So take all that for what you will. Now let's move on, talk about recoil. I calculated recoil using 8-pound rifles for each cartridge shooting Hornady Precision Hunter ammo. I pulled bullets from Hornady factory ammo, weighed the powder charges. These two cartridges have virtually identical recoil. Not surprising, virtually identical bullet weights at nearly the same velocity using similar amounts of powder. The 270 comes out actually a little ahead here, but only has about 2% less recoil than the 6.5 PRC, so you basically can call it a wash. Both are very shootable cartridges. You're going to have a lot more variation going from one rifle to another in the same cartridge than you will from one cartridge to another using the same rifle. Now let's talk about barrel life. On average, when dealing with barrels of similar quality that are used and maintained in a similar manner, the 270 will, on average, have a slightly longer barrel life than the 6.5 PRC. Both cartridges are run at similar pressures. The 6.5 PRC uses a little more powder and has a smaller bore diameter. Jaden Quinlan from Hornady estimated an average of 1,100 to about 1,300 rounds of barrel life for the 6.5 PRC and 1,300 to 2,000 rounds for the 270 in a recent spreadsheet they published online. Now, both cartridges are a little bit rougher on barrels and are going to have shorter lives than a milder cartridge, like a 308 Winchester, for instance. But 1,000 plus rounds is still a substantial barrel life for someone primarily using these cartridges for hunting. All right, what about accuracy potential for these two cartridges? Like I mentioned earlier, Hornady implemented some design principles with both cartridges to help optimize accuracy. John Snow and I talk about this, episode 366 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Check it out for more details. But long story short, cartridges with a long neck for adequate neck tension on long, heavy, high BC bullets, a steep shoulder for head spacing, a fat case with minimal body taper, and a snug free bore diameter are all conducive to accuracy. The 6.5 PRC has all of those characteristics, while the 270 Winchester uses a much older legacy cartridge design. I'm not saying it can't be an accurate cartridge, but I am saying that on average, with factory rifles, factory ammo, the 6.5 PRC will be a little bit more accurate in the aggregate. All right, now let's talk about ammo availability. The 6.5 PRC is quite popular. Lots of companies make ammo for it, but the 270 has a gigantic edge here, probably because it has been around for so much longer. For instance, Midway USA lists 70 loads for the 270, 43 for the 6.5. Both are represented in many, but not all of the same ammo lines. Now, the 270 is available in almost any hunting ammo you can think of. It's available in premium lines and budget lines and everything in between. That's not as much the case with the 6.5 PRC, which is available in many premium lines, but not as many classic or lower price point offerings. So, for instance, 270, you can get it in plain old Remington Core Lock, Winchester PowerPoint, Federal Power Shock, Hornady American Whitetail, Nosler Whitetail Country, all that stuff. Those aren't high performance loads. They're very simple, low BC bullets. That stuff is totally fine for deer at typical ranges, but it's nothing exotic or fancy. Now, the 6.5 PRC is available in stuff like Remington Core Lock Tipped, Barnes Vortex, Vortex Long Range, Federal Fusion, Barnes Harvest Collection, Nosler Ballistic Tip, Nosler Trophy Grade Long Range, Federal Terminal Ascent, Hornady Precision Hunter, etc. That's all great. The 6.5 PRC is also the most popular and easiest to find ammo for all of the PRCs right now. But that said, the 270 Winchester is also available in all of those lineups I just mentioned too, plus all of those other ones I mentioned earlier for the 270 that the 6.5 PRC isn't available in. Now, of note, Hornady offers the 6.5 PRC in their match line of ammo, but not the 270 Winchester. The same is also true with Remington and their premier match ammo. So the 6.5 PRC definitely has a hunting match crossover appeal the 270 does not have here. Now, additionally, 270 Winchester ammo is typically cheaper than 6.5 PRC ammo. That is especially true when you compare the cheapest stuff for one to the other. It's also true when you're comparing two cartridges within the same ammo lineup. For example, cheapest 270 Winchester ammo I could find on Midway is Hornady Whitetail for $24.99 a box. Cheapest 6.5 PRC ammo is Norma Whitetail at $36.99 a box. Barnes Harvest Collection ammo in 270 is $38.99 a box, $43.99 for 6.5 PRC. Vortex long range in 270 is $53.99 versus $60.99 for the 6.5 PRC. All right, now let's talk a little bit about rifles. Interestingly, the situation here is a little bit different from the ammo situation. Sportsman's Warehouse lists 116 6.5 PRC rifles on their website, 53 270 rifles. Midway lists 88 6.5 PRC rifles and 66 270 rifles. So there's a lot of overlap here, but there are a couple of trends. The 270 is very popular in classic hunting rifles. Winchester Model 70 featherweight, for instance. Very iconic 270 rifle chambering. Bergara makes it in their Sierra, Ridge, Timber, and Hunter lines. I wouldn't say any of those are old-fashioned rifle designs, but they're also not the latest and greatest cutting-edge stuff either. You can also get the Browning lever-action rifle and the Browning automatic rifle in 270, but not 6.5 PRC. Now, on the flip side of the coin, you can get the 6.5 PRC in some classic hunting rifles, right? You can get it in a Model 70, for instance. But in general, we're going to see this cartridge more in more lightweight rifles and more modern rifles. For instance, the Bergara MG Microlight with its folding chassis and really short barrel is a good example here. You can get that in 308, 6.5 Creedmoor, and 6.5 PRC, but not 270. That's an ultra lightweight, short barrel, folding stock rifle, 5.9 pound slick from the factory, 18-inch long barrel. You can also get it from Bergara in their Crest Carbon rifle, which has some of those same features, not the folding stock. You can also find the 6.5 PRC in more long-range setups, right? The Ruger Precision Rifle, the Ruger Hawkeye Long-Range Target, the Bergara Divide. Now, some rifles are in both chamberings, Browning X-Bolt, Model 70, Winchester XPR, etc. But that classic versus modern and conventional range versus long-range setup those are the dividing lines that you often see with these two cartridges. But yes, there is some overlap with them. So with all that said, which one is right for you? Like I mentioned earlier, the 270 and the 6.5 PRC perform in a similar manner on game when both are used with the same bullets and under the same conditions. So I would not hunt one particular animal with one cartridge that I would not hunt with the other cartridge. So this is a prime example of how most of the time bullet selection matters much more than cartridge head stamp. Now, the two primary differences between these rounds are more situational and equipment-based than anything else. So first, no real practical difference between them at closer range. On anything, you would reasonably hunt with either one. And I would hunt basically anything this side of Cape Buffalo with a 270 or a 6.5 PRC. Deer, elk, bear, whatever. Use an appropriate bullet, put it in the right spot, it will kill the heck out of any of those animals. Which one is a better deer round? It's really hard to pick. It's more a matter of personal preference on what you think is cool and what gear you prefer to hunt with. Now, if you like more of a classic hunting rifle or you want to hunt with cheaper ammo like Remington Corelock or Winchester PowerPoint, well, the 270 is the easy choice here. But even here, you could certainly use a 6.5 PRC. You don't have as many options, but Winchester offers it in their Model 70 Super Grade, for instance. No Corelock ammo in that chambering, not right now anyway, but you could use Federal Fusion ammo, for instance. Now, if you prefer a more modern rifle design with a threaded barrel, a folding stock, a carbon barrel, a shorter barrel, whatever, you should probably lean more towards a 6.5 PRC. That is more, but not exclusively, the domain of the 6.5 PRC. And yes, you can get a modern build 270 with a threaded barrel, a synthetic stock, stuff like that. Now, Grandpa's old 270 won't look like that. You'll need to thread it, put on a suppressor or a brake and a new stock and all of that. But if you wanted to, you could get a new production 270 rifle with those features. But what if you really need something to reach out there at ranges past 400 yards? That is a domain for a small number of hunters, but it's also much more the domain of the 6.5 PRC than the 270. I'm not saying the 270 can't be accurate. I'm not saying it doesn't work at long range, but this is where the accuracy advantage of the 6.5 PRC comes into play. Same thing with the better availability of high BC bullets, all of that stuff. And I want to reiterate here that buying a 6.5 PRC doesn't make you capable of shooting a deer or an elk at 800 yards. I think it is the superior cartridge for that work out of these two, but there's also a lot that goes into making a shot like that. Most people don't have any business taking a shot at 600 plus yards or even at closer ranges than that. And yes, you certainly can ethically take longer range shots with a 270. Just use the right ammo for it. Your Remington Core-Lock and your Winchester PowerPoint ammo, need to leave that stuff at home. Go with one of those higher BC loadings I talked about, like that Hornady Precision Hunter load, or the Nosler Trophy Grade long range load with 150 grain Accubon long range. Provided your rifle shoots that stuff accurately, simply switching from a classic bullet design over to a more modern, higher BC bullet design gets you most of the way there to what the 6.5 PRC is doing, but you also don't have to get a new rifle in the process. And if you hand load and you're using a 270 with a fast twist barrel, et cetera, that gets you closer to the 6.5 PRC in many areas, but then it's less of a turnkey situation. So if you had to choose only one, what would it be? I'd say a lot of it comes down to personal preference and the sort of hunting you are doing. Nostalgists should choose the 270. Those who like more modern things should go with the 6.5 PRC. There are very few situations where I'd say a 6.5 or a 270 is the wrong answer. Both will work great for a lot of the same stuff. But like I said, the answer here really just depends on your preferences, abilities, specific hunting conditions. There is nothing wrong with wanting or using one, but I also admit there is also no real need for a 6.5 PRC or even a 270 shooting high BC bullets if you are only shooting at game inside 300 to 400 yards. At that point, it really is a hunt with what you want sort of situation. And I must give the hat tip to the guys at Winchester who designed such a fantastic cartridge in the 270 that is still performing so darn well over 100 years after it hit the scene. That cartridge is still fantastic with classic bullet designs, and with more modern bullets, it improves the performance of that fantastic round even more. Now, you are, of course, welcome to disagree with me here about anything I have said. I'm just calling things like I see it, but you can let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with me. You can also email me, John at the Big Game Hunting blog, share your thoughts. If you are listening to this episode on Spotify, answer the question there. Which one do you prefer, the 6.5 PRC or the 270? Now, I've mentioned in the past, I am a part owner of North Fork Bullets. I've talked about in this episode how our bullets are available for both cartridges. I think both are ideal for hunting in many situations, from pursuing game like whitetail deer and hogs in the USA, up through bigger game, bear, elk, African plains game, and the like. Visit thebiggamehuntingblog.com/NF or thebiggamehuntingblog.com/NF-Midway. Both links are in the episode description, but go to either of those links. It will take you to the North Fork website or the North Fork section of the Midway USA website. As I record this, there are 264 cal and 277 cal bonded soft point bullets in stock in most weights. Those are just component bullets for hand loaders, but you can contact the folks at Pendleton Ammo, Hendershots Ammo, or Lonnie Cribb at Superior Ammunition. They will make a custom hand load for a variety of cartridges for you if you would like to hunt with them yourself. And finally, I invite you to join the community I am building on Patreon at patreon.com/biggamehunter. In addition to some of the other bonuses I provide there from time to time, like the ability to vote on future podcast cartridge comparisons, like this exact one that I recorded based upon Patreon supporter feedback, I also do things like share the results of some ballistic gel tests with the folks on Patreon there first. For instance, Patreon supporters saw that 264 cal North Fork semi-spitzer gel test I mentioned earlier months before anyone else in the world. I also prioritize correspondence with my supporters on Patreon above anyone else. I also offer other cool bonuses to my supporters, so sign up at the link in the show notes. That'll do it for this episode. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.